don't make my mistake and lock yourself into that old school type thinking of just shut down every power saving feature, shut down these protections, your system will improve. Actually, it hurts the logic, it hurts the algorithm. You can unlock this system by just leaving that stuff alone. Welcome back to WunjoTek. I'm Dave, and I just could not be happier, guys, to present this architecture to you. This 265K rig, I've had this for a long time. I've had a lot of time to mull over this system and to learn its idiosyncrasies, and it is a very, very interesting architecture, and it pays to unlock it. So I'm looking forward to sharing with you guys what I learned about it. When I was building the 9800X3D system, that was for a friend. I had a customer, so I was feeling that pressure to deliver. But with this one, I've had these components that I purchased with my own money for a very, very long time, and I've had a lot of time to sit with this system and to learn its ins and outs. 265K, small form factor build, 5070 Ti, and let's get into the system specs so I can show you what I'm working with here. For Ultra 7 265K, the gigabyte card is made for small form factors, got a locked power slider, and it's a little bit slimmer. 2x24 MDI 7600 CL36 is where it started. MDI has more cells, which means more switching, which means more heat, but in my experience, it requires less voltage to reach its overclock ceiling. The motherboard is an ASRock Z890i Nova. 2-DIMM board, obviously, because it's ITX. SSUPD Meshroom D is a bit of a mainstay in this small form factor space. The Be Quiet Pure Loop 3 is my AIO cooling solution. And I've got a Corsair 1000-watt small form factor little PSU. And the primary drive is a Sabrent Rocket 4 Plus 2 terabyte. So the last architectural deep dive that I did was the 9800X3D. And I think it's good to reflect on that component when comparing it to Arrow Lake, because it's just totally opposite. And it's funny how two different modern architectures can work. With the 9800X3D, my principle in tuning that rig was let the curve do the work. Let the curve do the curve does everything you need it to. No V-core offsets. I hated that 200 megahertz boost feature. It was just all about working within the curve and the curve alone. And what do I mean by that? Well, if you pull the curve down with a negative PBO offset, you lower the voltage. And the algorithm looks at its fit logic, looks at its thermal and power budget, and says, okay, I have more to work with now. I'll reward you with some more boost. And it boosts the core clock higher when you lower the voltage. That's the way it mostly works on that X3D variant of the AM5 architecture. This Arrow Lake is not like that at all. Okay, it's not a negotiation. You give Intel the ratio, you tell them what you want your ratio of your P cores, E cores to be, and it tells you what your voltage is going to be. Okay, it's just like that. You're giving it plots on a fucking vid table, dude. You're not pulling the curve down, you're not negotiating anything. You can't just let the curve do the work. You are going to pay a voltage penalty when you give it a higher boost ratio. Okay, it's simple as that. It's not a negotiation. Intel will tell you what you're getting and what it'll cost, and the answer is more. It'll cost more. 5.6 gigahertz has a cost that was decided at the fab. It's all in the vid table, dude. You don't get higher boost on this architecture without higher voltage. I want to talk for a second about the nature of synthetic workloads versus dynamic workloads, because I use Cinebench a lot for testing and because it's a useful tool even when tuning a gaming PC. And you have to understand what happens when you miss a cache. So in the latency video, we talked about having warm caches, and that's why I recommend, especially if you're playing competitive titles, warm your system up a bit. You know, put it through its paces just a little bit before you start playing the game. Make sure that your working sets are resident in L1s. They don't have to miss a cache and look at slower layers, L2, L3, and system DRAM. Make sure your system is hot. Make sure your caches are hot. If you're playing competitive titles, you'll benefit from that. So, but Cinebench has cache misses just like games do. But the difference is Cinebench knows where the next batch is. It misses a cache, big deal. It has just a ton of math that it can run and throw in the background and throw at these cores. It doesn't worry about it. You're not going to feel the cache miss because it's so predictable. It knows exactly where it's going next. It just fires off more requests. One miss doesn't hurt. It's got that pile of math, but games are the exact opposite. So in the Ashes of the Singularity video, we discussed Amdahl's law. Amdahl's law says that the serialization point is always going to be the bottleneck of any process, no matter how parallelizable that process is. It will always be bottlenecked by that one serialization point, that point where things need to synchronize. Well, games have lots of those and lots of dependencies. AI and physics depend on the world state. Culling, what the camera sees when you're looking around, that depends on spatial queries, and draw calls depend on state changes and texture and geometry. And when you have a cache miss, the games can spread their duties out among various threads and cores, and they do that very well, better and better. But work within that one core work on a different core can't fix the stall that's on this one. So data from a cache miss will give that game the next address, and if it doesn't have that address, there's nothing more to work on. It can't just throw a pile of math at it like Cinebench can, because it's a dynamic workload, it's volatile, it's not predictable in the way that synthetic workloads are. Now, Cinebench is a tool, and you can use it to great effect for tuning a gaming machine. Like, for example, if your core negative offsets are too aggressive, you'll BSOD when you're doing a multi-core run. If your core clocks are too high, you'll throttle. If you have an unstable uncore overclock, you'll freeze. And of course, Cinebench is great for viewing your worst case thermals. But as the saying goes, you don't play Cinebench. Games are volatile. When your caches are cold, your latency spikes and your frame times suffer. What you feel is frame times, not throughput. Okay, so this is a bit of a primer for those of you who haven't seen my videos, and for those who have, I'm introducing a new methodology for how I do game benchmarks. Okay, the formula that I use is delta as percentage of average FPS. So I take average FPS, I take the 1% lows, I subtract the 1% lows from the average FPS, and I get that delta, and then I divide that delta by average FPS to produce delta as percentage of average FPS. So this is basically just the percentage difference between average FPS and 1% lows, and your goal when tuning a gaming rig is to get that that delta narrower and narrower and as narrow as possible. The ideal state would be no difference at all between average FPS and 1% lows. You're not going to get there, but that's what you're driving towards. Now, the reason I do in-game testing and not synthetic benchmarks is because you can't test a memory OC or the performance of a gaming CPU on a synthetic benchmark for the same reasons that Cinebench is not going to tell you what your gaming performance is. But if you improve these deltas, your games will run better. Now, for the methodology that I've used on this channel, delta as percentage of average FPS, I realized, too late, mind you, too late, but I did eventually realize that there were a couple problems with it. So I'm going to go over the possible objections to this methodology, and I'm going to show you the measure that I'm taking to improve the accuracy of my numbers. So one objection is, as we talked about, warm caches. So, you know, you could talk about deltas, you could talk about improving 1% lows, but if you're only doing in-game testing and then you're only testing parts of the game that you keep on replaying, well, that's going to make your numbers look really good because you're going over warm caches. Okay, so I will say that in this game suite, I tested Marvel's Spider-Man 2. If you've played that game, you know you're zipping around New York City. I mean, there's really no other place to test the game. If you're going to test the performance in game, you're going to be zipping around New York City. But even though there's a risk of just running over these very warm caches, it's a gigantic map. I mean, it's huge. It's pretty much the size of New York City. So that mitigates the problem somewhat. Also, every run that I did in Spider-Man from pass 0 to the final pass was in that same map. So there's some repeatability there. So I trust the gains that I made, but I just want to make my audience aware of this possible objection to my methodology. For the other games, I haven't beaten Cyberpunk, and I beat Zero Dawn, but not Forbidden West. So everything I'm testing in these games are areas that are new to me. So we don't have as much a risk of running over warm caches and artificially inflating my numbers. I do avoid certain areas in the map. For example, in Forbidden West, I avoid the cauldrons. I don't benchmark the cauldrons because they're so radically different from the rest of the map, you know, and I think benchmarking there doesn't give a good idea of what gameplay actually feels like in the main map. Boss battles, I do not benchmark boss battles. Why? Because it's a tiny sliver of map, and like imagine benchmarking like a Dark Souls game. You're constantly getting yeeted and then getting back into this one area of the map, which is very, very small, and you're running constantly over these warm caches. So I don't benchmark these areas. What I'm benching in these games, with the exception of Spider-Man, which I talked about, I'm benching linear game progress. So the other objection that I can see is in the delta percentage, this delta is percentage of average FPS. Well, how long are the runs? Okay, because if I get a 15% delta in a 4-minute run, that doesn't count the same as a 20% delta in a 2-minute run. So you've got to use the duration of the runs to weigh the average. And I admit, I realized this far, far too late. So in starting with this video, I've introduced weighted deltas as the metric that I am going to be using to benchmark games, and I'm going to go ahead and show you how I arrive at those weighted delta percentages. It's quite simple, really. Okay, so you have two runs here. Run A, average FPS 100, 1% lows, 80, producing a delta percentage of 20% for a duration of 4 minutes. Run B, average FPS 100, 85 in the lows, 15%, and a duration of 2 minutes. So you could take that delta percentage from 20%, make it a hard 20 and 15, multiply 20 and 15 by the length of the respective runs, take the sum of those runs, of that multiplication that you just did, and divide it by the sum of the length of the run in seconds, and you get 18.33, which if you convert into a percentage is your weighted delta. And then here you could do the same thing if you do the length of the run in minutes instead of seconds. Here's another way to do it. Take your 1% lows, divide it by average FPS, so you produce that percentage there, multiply that by the length of the runs, take that sum and divide it by the sum of the length of the runs in seconds. You get 81%. In this case, you get a percentage, and then you subtract that from 1, and there's your 18.33%, and you can do the same thing with the length of the run in minutes. And so you see the previous method, which we're deprecating on this channel, where I've taken run A and run B and counted them as the exact same, even though one is 4 minutes long and one is 2 minutes long. That produces a delta S percentage of average FPS of 17.5%, and that is wrong. You see the weighted average, the new method that we're going to be using, which takes into account the duration of those runs and produces an accurate weighted average of 18.33%. So before we get into these tuning passes, I just want to set them up a little bit by reminding you this is a small form factor case, so that limits you. You've got a very tight thermal budget here to work with. You don't want to push things too much. Believe me, I got fans all over this thing. 120s, 80s, 40s. I've got two 40mm fans blowing straight onto the DIMMs to keep them right around 55 degrees. It's a very small box and not a lot of room for all this thermal activity, so there's a lot of heat soak. So you pay a big penalty for clocking cores too high. You want everything nice and stable to position yourself with that thermal penalty does not hurt you. So it's a bit tough to push these things to the absolute max, all these clocks, these uncores, the P-core and E-core clocks. You can't push them too much in this case. Same with memory. I was able to overclock the memory a little bit. Could I have gotten another 100, 200 megahertz out of it? Yeah, sure. But you got to pay a penalty for that, and that penalty is maximized in a very small chassis. So that was one challenge, and the other challenge was I couldn't get this thing to perform. I found something out about this architecture that really unlocked it. Now, performance out of the box was adequate, more than adequate, it was pretty good in games, but I just couldn't get it to really show itself. I couldn't really unlock it, and I was preparing to make a kind of a disappointing video. Oh, you know, tuning is dead. What can you do? And it's a small form factor case, and I couldn't blah blah, making excuses for myself. But then I discovered something. I discovered what this architecture needs, and I'm very happy to show it to you, even though it contradicts many of the fundamental assumptions that I've always had about tuning a gaming rig. So I'll get to that when we present the game benchmarks. But for now, let's go ahead and get right into the tuning passes, and you can see what I did to this system. Pass 0 is the baseline. This is the setting that most closely resembles the average user's system state. If they build it, chances are they're only going to go into the BIOS to turn on XMP, and if they bought a pre-built, this is how it'll arrive. I'm calling Pass 1 Housekeeping. These are latency-focused settings that will likely have little effect on frame times, but they provide a nice clean system state free of extraneous settings. But these are up to the user. I like to specify the PCIe device, meaning the graphics card, as the primary adapter. This tells the firmware not to treat the integrated GPU as a display device. Remember, your discrete GPU has its own VRAM. The iGPU doesn't. It has to borrow system RAM. You'd want to prevent that, especially while tuning memory. iGPU can actually interfere with memory training. However, just setting the primary adapter won't prevent that. All that does is determine which GPU handles display output, but the iGPU will still initialize its rails and load ACPI, Advanced Configuration and Power Interface, which will let Windows configure and directly control it as a device. In order to fully disable the iGPU device, you have to disable iGPU multi-monitor as well. We discussed virtualization in the latency video. With virtualization enabled, Windows runs on top of the hypervisor. It's the hypervisor that Windows talks to, not your hardware. Your system becomes the VM, essentially. Windows becomes the guest inside a VM controlled by a hypervisor. The hypervisor decides core allocation, interrupt routing, memory mapping, and when I say that your system is fully virtualized, I mean it. Page tables, PCIe, NVMe, and USB devices, interrupts, timers, nothing's on bare metal with virtualization enabled. Your CPU, memory devices, and OS are all virtual. Although virtualization today is far more efficient than it used to be, you can still see a small drop in FPS and lows and some added memory latency with it on. In any case, as long as you don't use it, there's no penalty for getting rid of it. And that applies to other settings here. Onboard WAN is actually Bluetooth and Wi-Fi, which I don't use. Just like iGPU, it initiates in firmware and produces an ACPI node to talk to Windows. And just like these devices, SATA controllers also enumerate and add Windows drivers, whether or not they're populated. If this PC were one of 100 in an office and I were managing them, I could save a lot of headache by using PXEBoot, pre-boot execution environment, to load an OS or a diagnostic tool from a central stack over a local network. Network stack enables that. Like all these other unneeded devices, it allocates for itself a portion of system memory. So we disable it. Now, if you've seen any of my videos, particularly the 9800X3D one, there are some settings in this pass that are conspicuous in their absence. As a rule, I hate C states. I hate unnecessary idling from PCIe and USB devices. I don't like power saving features at all, and I typically disable every one of them I can find at the firmware level. I'd normally disable C states and speed step here, and initially that's exactly what I did. I had to go back on one of my core principles by leaving C states enabled on this platform, and it makes me weep to admit that, but I can't argue with the data. I'll talk more about this when I get into the gaming results. So, Pass 2, DRAM tuning. Boy, I'm going to be spending a lot of time on this one slide. So if you take this cast latency value TCL of 40, multiply it by 2000 and divide that result by the transfer rate of 8400, you'll get 9.52 nanoseconds. That's actually a higher value than my XMP profile of 7600 CL36. But remember that this only applies to a page hit. In other words, a read to an already open row. That's a page hit. You can see my T-Refi video for a super high level primer on rows and columns, pre-charging, and some other basic terminology. TCL is the speed of access to the first data word on the bus. Now, if it's not a page hit, that is, if the row you want is not open, you have to close the one that is. That's TRP, row to pre-charge. Pre-charging a row is how the row is closed. Then you have to activate the row you want, and that's TRCD, row to column delay, which is basically the time to open a new row. Now, TRTP, read to pre-charge, is what it says it is. And what happens when you go from read to pre-charge? Well, that's permission to close the row. So what's TRCD when the new row is opened, plus TRTP when the row is closed? Well, that's TRAS, row active time, which is the shortest possible open to close path for a row. I got TRAS by adding TRCD to TRTP and then adding another 4 clock cycles so that the row doesn't close while data is still being read or written. So it's just a little bit of an extra padding there. So the reason I named these examples about TRTP and TRCD and the interrelationship with those to TRAS is because these are examples of when one timing depends on another, and that doesn't always happen. But I've now tuned DDR5 within 3 different high-end architectures on this channel, and I can say that knowing about the dependent relationships that do exist across these timings, and there are many more examples, takes a lot of time and stress away from the project of memory tuning. I've decided to make a video just about RAM tuning. I've done something like that before, but I didn't love how it turned out, and I've gained more experience. I'll be including DDR5 overclock configurations for Raptor Lake, Arrow Lake, and AM5, and I'll talk about the formulas you can use consistently across architectures, at least with respect to DDR5. So stay tuned to the channel for that. For now, I'll just highlight a couple key observations in Pass 2. Like AM5, the TREFI limit is 65535. Again, please see my TREFI short if you don't know what this does. In most cases, it will be the single largest performance uplift within your RAM tuning profile. In brief, DRAM cells are capacitor transistor pairs. Capacitors leak charge and have to be refreshed. That's why your DRAM runs refresh cycles. During these cycles, cells being refreshed are unavailable for anything else. TREFI is the amount of clock cycles between refreshes. Increasing the number increases the interval between refresh cycles, which means fewer refresh cycles, which means the cells spend more time reading and writing and doing the stuff that can help you in games. Run TREFI too high and the cells don't get refreshed and you get bit flips and other data corruption. Where TREFI is the interval between refresh cycles, TRFC is the length of that individual refresh cycle. Bringing TREFI up and TRFC down means less time spent on refreshing, which means more time for reads, writes, and copies. And the thing to know here is what kind of sticks you're running, because this is 2x24M die, which will not tolerate low TRFC values as easily as 2x16A die. The 2x24 kit is simply denser. It contains 50% more memory cells. More cells means more total electrical charge needs to be pumped into the chip during a refresh cycle. For this video, I tuned TRFC in 32 clock cycle increments. This isn't strictly necessary. It just aligns with DDR5's burst length of 16. Since one request fills 16 data slots, increments of 32 ensure that every step I take opens up a new usable slot for data to move. It just doesn't pay to adjust this in increments of 5 or 10. 672 never failed me, 640 did, and if I wanted to devote more time to this, I'd step TRFC down from 672 in increments of 8 until I found the exact error point between 672 and 640. Turnaround timings are the wait times required when the memory controller switches between different types of actions or different parts of the sticks. Read to write, write to write, read to write, write to read. And the farther the memory controller has to travel to make the switch, the longer the timing must be. SG, same bank group. DG, different bank groups on the same stick. DR, different ranks on the same stick. DD, different DIMMs or different sticks. Of these turnarounds, only write to read makes use of a specific formula. That's the write latency, TCWL, plus write to read time, TWTR, plus half the burst length, 8. You're using half the burst length because this is dual data rate, meaning data is being transmitted on both the climb and the cliff of the square waveform. On top of that, I added another 2 clock cycles of padding to ensure data integrity. TWRRD-DG is the same formula, just using TWTR short instead of TWTR long. Short is for a different bank group, and the reason accessing a different bank group takes less time than accessing the same one you're already on is that banks inside a group share the exact same internal wires. So when data is accessed across different parts of the same bank group, the hardware must physically wait for that charge to clear out before the same wires can safely read data. Again, I'll go into more detail when I do the RAM tuning video. I just wanted to clarify what these turnarounds are doing. Now, as mentioned, this is 2x24 die. It ran 7,600 mega transfers per second in XMP1. Here we've clocked it another 800. I'm not necessarily against re-enabling fast boot once you've dialed in your timings and voltages and verified your stable daily setup. When you are tuning, however, it's necessary to disable this because it forces full memory training on every boot. If you're toggling settings and frequencies and timings, you need full retrain cycles. Forcing the system to boot past those introduces the risk of booting with an unstable overclock. For the settings, I disable power down, which lets DRAM enter low power states during idle periods. Waking them back up requires reinitializing sense amplifiers and resyncing internal clocks. Training consistency is improved when the DIMMs are kept fully awake. Gear 2 means the IMC runs at half the DRAM clock. You're not getting Gear 1 at these frequencies. The IMC cannot physically clock high enough to stay synchronous with a DRAM clock of 4200 megahertz. So the only purpose of specifying that it's in Gear 2 is to ensure that BIOS doesn't try to run Gear 1 if the setting is left on auto. The command address bus, CA bus, is the physical set of wires on a DDR5 DIMM that carries every instruction the memory controller sends to DRAM. It carries activate, precharge, read, write, refresh, bank and row and column addresses, etc. These signals must arrive at the DRAM cleanly and in sync for the DIMM to understand what the IMC wants. It's impossible to latch all these commands within one clock cycle at high frequencies. Again, you set 2N manually so BIOS doesn't try anything adventurous. I want to talk about these voltages with respect to a concept I've covered before on this channel, fault domains. So let's go ahead and split these voltages into these fault domains so I can illustrate the point. The three fault domains for RAM tuning are signal integrity, core logic, and timings. When you are pushing clocks and tightening timings, you're going to error in Carhu, in OCCT, in memtest86. You're going to BSOD, you're going to crash in games, you're going to be living in your BIOS. You need a framework for achieving desired performance. Sure, you can just change one timing at a time, 100 megahertz at a time, then back this off or that off, but there might be a mechanism for getting where you want to go through knowing which voltages to push. So first, let's identify these fault domains. System agent, VNN, AON, VDDQ, and VCC-IO lie within the signal integrity domain, although VNN, AON I consider more of a hybrid. Signal integrity means what it says. Are you providing enough voltage headroom for disparate components to communicate effectively across the traces of the motherboard? This domain covers command address bus stability, DQ bus stability, IMC to DRAM communication, stability at high frequencies. System agent doesn't touch core clocks at all. It is an uncore voltage rail. That includes the memory controller. It stabilizes the command address bus and enables consistent memory training. A lot of times a bump in SA can stabilize high memory clocks, but be careful because if you run it too hot, the returns diminish and you risk degradation. And all it'll do at that point is heat up the sock tile. Now, in my opinion, VNN AON lies between signal integrity and core logic. This is a tiled architecture, the 265K Arrow Lake. So with compute, SOC, and IO on separate tiles connected by a die-to-die link, the wake path has to cross tile boundaries, and VNN AON is really all about wake timing, transitions, and retention. It's not completely a signal integrity rail because it has nothing to do with pushing bandwidth across the D-to-D fabric. On the other hand, it doesn't sit inside a given component and govern that component's core logic the way VDD2 does for the IMC or DRAM VDD does for the DRAM die. So it's neither completely signal integrity nor core logic. Nonetheless, if you bump uncore clocks, you're creating a tighter timing budget for transistors to switch and gates to open, and a corresponding bump in VNN AON can help that uncore overclock to post. And VDDQ is the voltage that powers the data bus signaling between the CPU and DRAM. It is the electrical strength behind every read-write operation on the DQ bus, the data queue, the wires that actually carry your bits. And you can think of VCC-IO as doing the same job, but for the command address bus. It powers the IMC's IO buffers. Moving on to core logic, VDD2 and VDD lie within the core logic domain, the internal logic of the DRAM chip or the internal logic of the CPU. Think of signal integrity as anything that travels and core logic as anything that holds down the fort wherever it is. This domain covers the internal logic of both the DRAM chips and the CPU's memory controller. It's the part responsible for actually performing row activation, pre-charge, refresh, IMC scheduling, etc. Now, I can't give you a concrete rule for which domain to address when you error in memtest. Generally speaking, I'd say that you can tick up DRAM VDDQ when you're pushing clocks and DRAM VDD when you're dialing in refresh behavior, but truth be told, which domain to address is not something that holds uniformly across architectures. But let's say you try 8600 megatransfers per second and it doesn't pass. You might consider a DRAM VDDQ bump. If it still doesn't pass, you might consider pushing system agent. Now, if that doesn't pass, maybe you've targeted the wrong domain. Maybe it's the internal memory controller. I would then set VDDQ and system agent back to where they were and provide a bit more voltage to VDD2. And that's what I mean. If you're not getting stability through pushing voltages tied to one domain, back them off. Don't push signal integrity and core logic at the same time. You'll find that you'll need to raise both at some point for a full tune, but only ever target one domain at a time. Believe me, if the problem is one of signal integrity, it'll stay a problem of signal integrity until you fix the issue. And how do you know which domain contains the issue? You know it by the progress you make. So if you errored at 8,000 megatransfers per second with system agent at 1.2 volts, but passed memtest at 8,200 megatransfers per second with system agent at 1.25, then you know your clocks are tied to signal integrity, which also tells you that your IMC is strong, since you didn't need to budget. That said, if you error again at 8,400 megatransfers per second, don't rely on signal integrity being the answer. It's a different issue because it's a different speed. You may have reached the point where a bump in VDD2 or memory controller voltage will provide stability over a bump in the SI rails. Isolate your fault domains and you'll make the cumbersome task of RAM tuning just a little bit easier. And the other domain is timings, and this one is pretty simple. If you're dialing in on a timing and you've isolated signal integrity and core logic and neither one is doing a damn thing, the timing is set too low. That's it. I encountered this in the turnarounds with the DR and DD timings. My sticks are single rank, so I just assumed that these timings didn't matter. I set all of them to 1 because there's no second rank to switch to. And that's even true when you switch DIMMs, the DD timing. It might switch to a different DIMM, but it doesn't necessarily switch to a different rank because each stick still only has 1 rank. And in theory, the memory controller shouldn't need to trigger different DIMM turnaround logic anyway. So for these turnarounds, DR is the same as DD. What I found weird was that memtest consistently rejected a value of 1 for these. What I discovered about this architecture is that the absolute physical limit for the memory controller to register any state change between ranks or DIMMs, even dummy cycles on unused paths, requires a minimum window. A value of 1 cycle is too narrow for the hardware logic gates to process the switch. It wasn't until I switched all the DR and DD timings to 4 that I passed memtest with no issue. A value of 4 cycles gives the memory controller just enough time to cycle its internal registers safely. Wasn't an issue of signal integrity or core logic voltage because it wasn't a voltage issue. This is an example of an issue that lay squarely in the timings domain. A lot of timings you can go to you can get them to post with adjustments in those other two domains, but many tertiary and turnaround timings are ignorant of voltage. They'll either post or they won't post. I just want to address these voltages here in Pass 2. They are lower than I expected. I was very pleasantly surprised that I was able to achieve an 800 mega transfer overclock to these dim sticks with really not much beyond stock voltage levels. So needing less voltage is a sign of a strong IMC. A strong IMC doesn't just hit high frequency, it does it with lower voltages, lower VDDQ, VDD2, etc. And Aerolink's IMC is cleaner. It's partly because of this massively oversized 2000-bit Foveros bridge and its redesigned data drivers and wider sampling windows. So we can give this architecture some credit here. I was really quite surprised with these voltage levels. So on to Pass 3 core tuning. Here I simply use Cinebench to identify my best and worst cores. From successive multi-core runs, I took hardware info logs on the performance of each core, recorded which ones achieved which clocks with which voltage demands, and averaged them out over many runs. And this is why I spent time at the beginning of the video talking about the differences between X3D and Aerolink, particularly in regard to boost behavior. Since boost and core voltage are inversely related on the 9800 X3D, I could afford to set the most aggressive offsets to my hero cores, to my best cores. Don't do that on Aerolink. Again, its boost behavior comes straight out of the vid table. It's almost crude, really. If you undervolt your best cores, you're crippling this chip and it'll be unstable. My hero cores have no offset. The tier beneath them has an offset, and the worst cores have the most aggressive offset. If you look at these turbo bins, I've told the system to boost to 5.6 gigahertz on the P cores when 2 cores are engaged, and 5.4 when they're all engaged. And I asked that only my hero cores be asked to boost to 5.6. My worst cores aren't ever going to achieve my best boost, so I improved efficiency by asking the worst cores to sacrifice the most boost potential. The E cores on this platform are grouped in clusters, 4 cores to a cluster. I simply addressed each cluster the way I would any individual P core. I identified the strongest performing cluster and gave it the smallest offset, saving the larger offset for the weakest cluster. Now, my chip is not a golden sample, and again, in a small form factor build, you have to be very careful where you choose to target your gains. Could I have pushed these ratios higher? Sure. I mean, in an ATX case, maybe. What's the goal, though? My goal is frame time consistency. Again, the only results that matter are the results in games. That's it. So would the added heat soak of an additional 100 megahertz have improved my lows, which were more than acceptable even at optimized defaults? The answer is no. And the same logic applies to this Uncore. This thing ships with NGU and D to D at stock ratios of 26 and I think 21 respectively. So while someone is always going to squeeze out another 100 megahertz, the bump here is significant. The NGU does the job that AMD's Infinity Fabric clock does, but in a very different way. It's similar in that it connects the compute tile to the SOC tile in the way FCLK connects the CCD to the IOD. It also connects to the memory controller and PCIe route. Every time a core needs data from DRAM, the request crosses the NGU fabric to reach the memory controller, and the data crosses it again coming back. A faster NGU clock means each of those crossings takes fewer nanoseconds. Same for GPU communication over PCIe, which is frame submission, resource uploads, and anything that crosses the bus. It's different than FCLK in that it's decoupled from RAM speed, whereas FCLK likes to stay within sight of a 1-to-1 ratio. The ring does the same job as the NGU, but in a different place. It's the interconnect within the compute tile. It's how the P cores, E cores, and L3 cache talk to each other. When one core needs data from an L3 slice owned by another core, the request travels the ring. The ring clock sets how fast those hops take. It's potentially more impactful for gaming than any other uncore clock, because a game's working set that fits in cache never touches the memory controller or NGU fabric. It lives and dies on ring latency. So faster ring means faster L3 access. It's also the path from core to core, so any engine that hands work between threads will benefit from a ring boost. I needed a significant override to stabilize 40, and 42 was not going to happen on this silicon. The D2D is the Foveros interconnect clock between compute and sock dies. The NGU fabric decides what to send. D2D is the pipe it travels through. You can think of it as the physical layer underneath NGU. And Intel went way overboard with it. It's roughly 2,000 bits wide. In terms of the usable bandwidth that can traverse it, it's so massively over-provisioned that games cannot even come close to saturating it. It's not like FCLK on AM5, which is only a 256-bit bus. The pipe on FCLK is tight enough that both bandwidth and latency are in play. Now, requests on the D2D bus will never start queuing. It's simply too massive. So the only latency you ever see is the fixed crossing time, which is purely a function of clock speed. Width has already solved half of the problem, and raising the clock addresses the other half, but there's so little of it left to address that the return is fractions of a nanosecond. On a narrow bus, you're fighting both queuing and crossing time, so both clock and width matter. On a bus this wide, queuing is 0. You can marginally increase the crossing time, but gaming gains are non-existent. The ASRock BIOS is pretty cool once you get used to it. It kind of sucks to not have a lookup for the settings you can't find in the menu, but after a little while you already know where everything you want to get to lives anyway. But what's really cool is all these options. This kind of thing is a gold mine for RAM tuning. If your OC can survive all this training, you know it's stable. Force cold reset forces the board to treat every boot as a cold boot. At 8400 with pretty tight timings, you want every boot to start clean. When training 1 and 2 are enabled, the board saves successful training results and reuses them on subsequent boots instead of retraining. To ensure stability of my OC, I disabled these. Real-time memory timing lets the board dynamically adjust timings after post based on runtime conditions. Disabling it locks in what you set. At higher frequencies, first attempt failures can happen. Retrain on fast fail is enabled to give training failures another shot. If all retries are exhausted and training fails completely, reset for MRC failed will reset the system and try again from scratch, rather than booting with degraded settings. I left MRC training on warm boot on auto, and now I can't remember if that's the default setting. But with force cold reset, warm boots already behave like cold boots though, so this one doesn't really matter. The point of this pass is to make use of these extensive BIOS options to refuse to trust cache training states. And this is all the settings in one place, so you can pause the video here and give them a look if you like. I wanted to mention the settings that I tested but found unhelpful or unworkable. 200S boost gave me BSODs. It ticks the D2D to 32. I tested that ratio several times, both at optimized defaults on every other BIOS setting and while playing with various voltages, and I could never get it stable. And D to D of 32 is completely useless anyway. To be clear, I enabled this at stock settings after a CMOS clear with only XMP1 loaded, so I gave it a fair shake. I wasn't able to test gaming performance because my games kept crashing with that silly D to D clock ratio of 32. Useless. BCLK overclocking is really cool, but in a small form factor case, I had already accepted as much of a thermal penalty as I was prepared to for P-core, E-core, Uncore, and RAM clocks. BCLK is what your clock multipliers multiply from. So if you set your ring to 40 and BCLK remains at its stock 100 megahertz, you'll be running ring at 4 gigahertz, and that works with every clock in that BCLK's domain. On this architecture, there are two BCLK domains, one for the compute tile and the other for the SOC tile. Compute BCLK governs the P cores, E cores, and ring. SOC BCLK governs DRAM frequency and the NGU and D2D clocks. So if you take my ratios of 5.4 all P core, 48 E core, and 40 ring, and set the compute BCLK to 101, you'll be running 5.454 gigahertz all P core, 4.848 gigahertz E core, and 4.04 gigahertz ring. And if you take my ratios of 84 DDR5, 32 NGU, 30 D2D, and set SOC BCLK to 101, you'll be running 8484 megatransfers per second DDR5, 3.232 gigahertz NGU, and 3.03 gigahertz D2D. So you get the point. You can adjust either BCLK domain independently of the other, or you can set different BCLK clocks for either domain. I think it's a really cool feature, and it provides a way to squeeze extra performance if you don't want to work in large increments. Again, I was constrained by the thermal penalties of a small case and chose to leave these alone after testing them. The juice just wasn't worth the squeeze. Yep. C-states. I kind of hate that Arrow Lake loves C-states so much. You'll see from the gaming results that this was the lever that significantly improved performance from stock. I don't have much to say about it. I tested it and I did not improve frame view numbers, input to photon measurements, game lag when I disabled C-states, which was surprising. On Raptor Lake, you need to shut C-states off if you're playing competitive games, and a 9800X3D is efficient enough that you lose nothing by disabling them. Arrow Lake needs them on, and you'll see this in the gaming results. Now, I played with an AVX2 ratio offset in order to lower temps and package power. Setting it to 2 will throttle clocks down 200 megahertz during AVX2 workloads. It's probably something I would not have even experimented with if this were a standard size chassis. I was surprised to discover that this had no effect either way in games. Temps and package power marginally decreased with it off, but at its auto setting of 0 or at the setting of 2 that I tested, frame times were the same. And that's even in the heavy AVX2 dependent titles I tested, like Battlefield 6. The only workload that was really affected was Cinebench, where the offset of 2 significantly lowered the multi-core score, but, you know, who cares? I was a bit surprised by how much this didn't matter. So another setting that falls in that category of things I played with but omitted from the final configuration was DLVR. I played with the DLVR a little bit to no great effect, and I ended up leaving it on its default. So let's talk about the DLVR, why it was necessary for chiplet designs, why chiplet and tiled designs are necessary now, and the DLVR's functioning within that. So on a monolithic die, all cores and cache and uncore and IMC are on one single slab of silicon, and it's easier for the VRM to supply voltage to a monolithic design because it's one predictable load. But now we have these tiled designs, so SOC has its own tile, compute, graphics, and then you've got this fabric interconnect, and each has its own voltage requirements and thermal and noise tolerances. So like the compute tile may spike when the sock is idling. And then you have VRM behavior, overshoot and undershoot. We talked about in the 9800X3D video. Cores spike, but the VRMs are slow to respond, and you get undershoot. The shooting and undershooting is what the VRMs do, not what the cores do. So the core rapidly transitions to idle, and the VRMs are still responding to that load vid request. So you get the overshoot there. So when you have the tiled architecture and the slowness of the response of the VRMs, the DLVR is there to bridge those two things. There to smooth the voltage so that the CPU tiles can get what they need and not have to suffer from the delayed response of the VRMs. So now, why chiplets? Why chiplets? Well, when you're shrinking process nodes in the production of a monolithic die, everything has to shrink. But what AMD discovered is that I/O interfaces and memory controllers don't benefit from being shrunk. So they saved a boatload of money because they said, let's reserve our best silicon for the CCD, and we'll leave the IOD on a more mature process node. And that leads to yields. That leads to better yields. As a CPU die is cut from a wafer. So the bigger the die, the better a chance it has of intersecting with errors that happen on that wafer. Dust particles, chemical impurities, just lithography errors, anything that can affect the wafer. That big thing that's being cut out of it has a bigger chance because of its size of intersecting with those errors. But with a chiplet or tiled design, those components are produced on their own wafer, on their own process node, and then stacked together. And the smaller the die, the better the yield. So how do AMD and Intel differ in their power delivery strategies for these chiplet and tiled architectures? Well, AMD has this digital low dropout regulator that sits inside the CCD, and it regulates the voltage after the IOD has already smoothed it. It's local in the CCD, but Intel's strategy is very different because it's got this vertical power delivery path. So the power travels to the base tile and then it climbs up to the compute tile and fans out to the cores and the ring and the cache and the IMC. And that vertical path leads to higher resistance and inductance and more transient distortion, more droop, more overshoot. So the DLVR has to sit right inside the substrate because it's got to smooth the voltage before it even gets to the base tile. So what did I try? I tried DLVR fixed ratio, and I tried, or fixed voltage, and I tried a DLVR negative offset, and neither worked. It's interesting because I thought they were going to work because I tested in Cinebench and it looked good. I got better numbers in Cinebench while my temps and package power got lower. And I thought, okay, great. And then I immediately crashed in games. Well, Cinebench, as we talked about, is very predictable, but games spike transients. So the DLVR will preemptively raise voltage to protect against those spikes. So you'll find if you do a hardware info log that your games will run a higher DLVR than Cinebench will. I also tried the DLVR bypass, but I didn't try the DLVR bypass because it doesn't really exist. It exists in an option in my BIOS, but it was nerfed by Intel at the microcode level. So it's not there anymore. So if you try to run it, you'll run into a fail-safe mode where the system says there's a power condition here. We can't guarantee safe operation. We'll run everything at their minimums until you roll back the setting. So there is no DLVR bypass. What was successful was the negative per core offsets. I set the negative per core offsets not too aggressive because you can't play too much with this architecture, but just a little bit ended up shaving like 5-8 degrees Celsius off temps during load, and also shaved down some package power off it. So that's what I used instead of DLVR fixed or offset. So I'm a bad news first kind of guy. Let me show you the bad news, and then we'll see if I can make up for it with the good. Here's the 5 games that I've tested in a couple configurations. I use DLAA to represent native rendering, DLSS balanced, a little bit harder on the CPU than, say, quality, but the idea was to approximate what your settings would be if you were actually playing these games. And here's the CPU temp and CPU package power in pass 0 being just optimized defaults with XMP1 enabled. You see about 60% CPU, or excuse me, 60 degrees CPU temp and 113 watts of package power, and they're going to go way up after this tuning to 68 degrees CPU temp and 140 watts of CPU package power, representing a 10% increase in CPU temp and a 19% increase in CPU package power. Like I said, it's just plots on a vid table with this architecture. You tell it the ratio that you want, it tells you how much voltage it's going to cost. Just very quickly before I get into the game benchmarks, I just want to give an update about the system state prior to all of these gaming passes. So if you've seen the latency optimization video, I did that entire suite on this system. And you can take the numbers from pass 0 as inclusive of that suite. In other words, all of the game benchmarks was done on a latency tuned system. Also, the same for the graphics card. I did an overclock and undervolt of the graphics card, and that applies to pass 0 and the final pass. The other thing I want to say is that pass 0 and the final pass are not the only passes I did. I did lots of final passes. I did pass after pass after pass after pass, and wasn't able to truly improve these deltas until this most recent pass. One other note about the graphics testing: there are times when you might notice the DLSS balanced numbers that I've produced get FPS than the DLAA numbers in the same game, which on its face doesn't make sense, but know that I'm only doing in-game testing here, and it just means I was in a different part of the map, that's all. But we're paying attention to these weighted delta percentages, not average FPS, which is especially true in an open world title, single player game, where you're not chasing frames in those types of games. I've talked about that in previous videos. So focus on the weighted delta. That's Frametimes. That's the delta between average FPS and 1% lows. That's what you'll feel. That's what matters. And now the long-awaited game results. After all this talking, this section will be done in 2 minutes. We'll start off with Warzone, because I got much love from my COD bros. 27% weighted delta, quite a good stock result. Down from 33% unweighted, which does tell you that our longest runs produced our best result. So that's good news. Battlefield 6, quite an outstanding result here, 20% at stock settings. Horizon Forbidden West, not as good. DLAA high presets 33% and about the same for DLSS balanced. Not the best stock result. Really good for Spider-Man 2, weighted delta 21% at DLAA, 30% when we tick up upscaling. And then Cyberpunk, 16% in stock results. This is just optimized defaults and XMP1 enabled. 16%, really, really, really good. I can tell you from experience taking these numbers that anywhere under 30% is playable. Over, you're starting to see some stutters. When you get around 20%, that is excellent. If you can get 15%, that is absolutely elite, and especially for a stock result. And now the final settings. Modest improvement in weighted delta in Warzone. This architecture doesn't run this game very, very well. It's still very, very playable, and a 26% is pretty good. Battlefield 6, excellent, excellent, excellent. 15%, a good improvement, down from nearly 20 in Past Zero. Horizon Forbidden West, DLAA made the biggest leap, I think, from around 32% all the way down to 22%. That is excellent. That's like a 30% improvement there. And weighted delta improved for DLSS balanced as well. And then we have Spider-Man 2, modest improvement, down a couple percentage points in native and down significantly in DLSS balanced. And then Cyberpunk, how can we improve on 16%? Well, we did. Absolutely amazing. Words cannot describe how well this game runs on this architecture. And here we see the averages from all the runs. 26%, the sweet average for Pass Zero, down all the way to 21% in the final pass, which, if you're taking these numbers, and I know because I guess I'm the only one who takes them, a 20% reduction like that is pretty much in line with full system tunes I've done on different architectures. Anyway, if you can average 20% across a suite of games and configurations, you're doing really, really, really well. So this architecture is terrific for gaming. So I've presented to you guys the baseline state Pass Zero, and I presented the final pass, which is the current system state. But it was a long walk to Robin Hood's barn in between there. That was just the last final pass. There were many final passes because I couldn't reconcile that I'd done all of this work on this system and hadn't improved the lows, hadn't improved those deltas, pass after pass after pass, setting after setting after setting. And even though the system was benched with synthetics, I knew that it was stable. Everything seemed to be doing what it was supposed to do. I wasn't able to extract that bit of gaming performance that I hoped was in there until I re-enabled 4 settings that I had disabled from the beginning. Let me show you what those settings are. So here are the 4 settings that I re-enabled before running that final pass that unlocked this performance that had been on the table. Disabling C states means the cores never enter deeper sleep. They generate more heat even when doing no work. Enabled, the CPU can shut idle cores down, and this frees up some thermal and power budget for the active gaming cores to use. And then there's the issue of the thread director. Windows uses this thread director to determine which threads should handle a given game task. It's possible that disabling C states blinds the thread director, so the game threads might get misdirected to the wrong core. That's my guess anyway. A couple guesses of why C states re-enabled improved gaming performance. Speed step in older architectures, so this might just be me being just too old school with all of these. In older architectures, turning this off would lock the CPU at maximum speed, but modern chips will often drop to a lower safe speed. They might do the opposite thing when you disable this. They'll drop to a lower speed. So speed step also works with speed shift to tell the CPU how much power and speed to use from millisecond to millisecond. It's possible that disabling this prevented the CPU from shifting clock speeds instantly, which would hurt it in sort of rapid burst transition to chew up draw calls and stuff like that during games. That's another guess. Undervolt protection. Undervolt protection does not stop you from dialing in per core undervolts. It stops the CPU cores from making vid requests that are dangerously low. But this was disabled when C states were, so there was no chance of any CPU core making a dangerously low vid request. Now that C states are back on, it makes sense to have this back on too, but this setting could not have been the culprit in hampering game performance. And then there's IACEP enable. So it's kind of the opposite of undervolt protection, where undervolt protection prevents vid requests that are too low. IACEP prevents vid requests that are too high. I think it's unlikely because I had pretty stable performance and I wasn't getting like BSODs or anything like that. But I guess it's possible that disabling this hurt boost transitions, which again would be effective for handling draw call bursts in games. It's possible. So those are just theories. I mean, I don't know. I don't know why re-enabling these settings for that final pass unlocked that so much gaming performance, because I was really banging my head against this thing for a while. But one thing is for sure, I hurt my own chances to unlock that performance by subscribing to a kind of an old school logic, which is just shut all this shit off, it's useless. To be fair, on newer architectures, it has been useless. I mean, I shut it all off on AM5, even when everybody and their mom was telling me, run the balanced power plan, leave C states on. I unlocked some great performance that was on the table for the 9800X3D system when I shut C states off, ran the bitsum power plan, etc. And for Raptor Lake, for sure, because I was getting like 5 millisecond response times in Warzone, and you can't do that with C states on. You almost have to turn off C states to play competitive games on Raptor Lake. But here on Arrow Lake, the situation is very, very different. And don't make my mistake and lock yourself into that old school type thinking of just shut down every power saving feature, shut down these protections, your system will improve. Actually, it hurts the logic, it hurts the algorithm. You can unlock this system by just leaving that stuff alone. So quick pros and cons here. The pros of this system, well, you saw those gaming results, you saw those deltas. Those frame times are the best I've seen of the modern architectures that I've tuned up, of Raptor Lake, of AM5. These were the best frame time deltas. These were the best 1% relative to average FPS that I've seen in any modern architecture. So that is a big plus. I mean, games here are buttery smooth. This thing really fucks. I mean, that's all I can say. So that's a definite pro of this architecture. But keep in mind that it pays to be conservative. Don't try to push those clocks too high, because that's the negative. It's a very, very stiff thermal and electrical penalty for only 100 megahertz. So I would really keep clocks as high as you can get while maintaining stability and consistency as your goals. You really shouldn't be trying to push clocks too high. In that sense, it's a little bit like X3D. But the way it's not like X3D is the big negative, and why perhaps I would have chosen AM5. I would have chosen an X3D chip if I were building another small form factor, because it really does run pretty hot. I mean, you saw these game results in the frame view data. We're increasing package power, on the X3D, I was able to bring the curve down, and CPU temps and package power went down with it while boost went up. That's not the relationship that you're going to find here. When you push this thing, it will respond with a voltage penalty, and it will run hot. So you've got to kind of be careful and be conservative. And if you're conservative and do things right, you can unlock a whole lot of gaming performance here. But just keep that in mind. This is not the one you want to push to its limits. But those are the pros and cons of this architecture. I had a lot of fun dialing this thing in. It was trouble. There are a lot of options. I was working with an ASRock BIOS that can be confusing, which I grew to really like. This architecture has a lot of interesting options and idiosyncrasies and a whole lot of BIOS options, and it's a lot of fun and a lot of frustration to play with. But I had a great time with this, and as you can see, we unlocked some terrific gaming performance from this architecture. And at the end of the day, it's a 20 core chip that's here in my little small form factor case, so I can carry it around with me, carry it to the office. It's pretty cool for work stuff, for production stuff as well. So I'm really happy with this purchase, and I'm happy that I got to share these discoveries with you. Advanced RAM tuning guide is coming up on all these architectures that I've played with in recent months, so stay tuned for that one. I hope that you've enjoyed going through this architecture with me, and I hope you've learned something. And remember, you don't know until you've tested it. You can listen to everyone in the world, but don't. Just test it yourself and see what you find. Don't even listen to me. You don't know anything until you've tested it. If you agree with that vision, then please like and subscribe to WunjoTek. I'll see you in the next one.